And the irony is that these groups are with Putin no matter what he does, pretty much. In the polls, it's the hawks who are actually most of the time in opposition to Putin during the peaceful period of time. And they only join Putin when Putin starts wars, which is, like, in their views, finally, he's been strong internationally, right? He's showing the West, like, what Russia is great. And during these moments when he started the wars, hawks join the loyalists who are already with Putin in the first place. This is how you get the increase in Putin's approval that typically spikes after he starts the wars.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of GNSI's Video Series. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer, the Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. Today, we're joined by Dr. Maria Snegovaya. She is the Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Today, we're going to discuss the Russian domestic support for the war in Ukraine. Well, welcome to the podcast, Maria.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Excellent. So let's get started with obviously, the war in Ukraine has been going on now for over 3 years, and we are not seeing that much domestic upheaval in Russia. We're not seeing a lot of protests. We're not seeing a lot of pushback, it seems, for the Putin regime. What's that mean?
I have to say that's one of the most surprising things about the war, which, first of all, everybody thought about this war being a complete surprise, right? If you remember late 2021, early 2022, most Russians were completely delusional about the possibility of this war, despite all the announcements, warnings coming from the US administration at the time. The perception in Moscow was, and I remember that very distinctly because I spoke to many people, and I was actually in Russia in late 2021, specifically with that goal in mind to understand how people felt about this. This is a ridiculous idea. Such a war would be a complete disaster for Russia, and Putin would have never started it. He's rational. He knows better. And my favorite is this is just a special operation by the U.S. of the kind that it ran in Iraq, basically, to create false excuses or whatever for its own purposes to discredit Russia. And then when it started, despite all these perceptions, everybody was in shock. The society was in shock. The elites were completely shocked because this decision was made by Putin within a very narrow circle of his closest associates. Majority of elites, including the economic bloc, had no idea about the war coming. And very much the same way as it happened back in 2014, I should mention. So despite all this shock and horror and horrible long-term consequences this war has created, not just for Ukraine, but for Russia as well, demographically, economically, diplomatic isolation, very uncertain Russian future, etc., etc. Nonetheless, the adaptation of both the elites and society to this war is absolutely remarkable. Already several months into the war, both the elites and society sort of readjusted their priors. And the Kremlin certainly helped them to do that. There were a lot of opportunities emerging thanks to the Kremlin's assistance to, create new beneficiaries of the war, stakeholders, so to speak. And so altogether, the new realignment of the society of the elites around this war is very impressive. This, of course, created a lot of discussion as to whether this is Putin's war or Russia's war. I'm happy to discuss this with you, Ted. But nonetheless, the reality is such that now 3 years into this war, there are really the war has imposed basically very long-term changes on the Russian society. It created a lot of new stakeholders. The changes in the composition of the Russian middle class, which replaced many of the educated specialists, like IT professionals, businessmen, with more of the militarized security type of employees who are now these are the most prestigious jobs in the society at the moment, and generally realigned the entire country in a way that made this war sustainable. And some of the analysts looking at the situation economically, at least, say that the war actually, believe it or not, is fairly cheap for the regime, and it can sustain it for quite some time.
Well, it's interesting because we saw protests in Russia in 2012 when Putin came back to power, right? Because of because of him stepping out, term limits, those things. So we saw that in the past, there's been some Russian pushback. What made it different this time that we just didn't see any major, the population was caught off guard, but still after 3 years now, we still haven't really seen anything. Why do you think?
I would say that the real changes have happened before. In fact, the 2011-12 protests that you mentioned were an eye-opener, not just for some of the Russian hopeful liberals, but also for more of the conservative groups on the side of Putin, the elites, from their view. And I'm saying that since I'm working on the book manuscript, actually trying to show that this is the war and the general turn in Russia's relationship with the West, the turn towards the worst, more antagonism and contestation has actually been the function not just of Putin, but the elites more broadly. And one of the issues that they realized back in 2011-12 is that from elites' perspective, Dmitry Medvedev, at the time, more of the pro-Western, pro-liberal guy, you wouldn't believe that if you read his Twitter posts these days. But from their view, from the view of these more conservative elites, Medvedev was taking Russia in the wrong direction, not reinforcing Russia militarily, not realizing that the West was actually the major challenge. In fact, instead opening Russia to all these deleterious influences of the West, which eventually, in their view, contributed to these protests. Because remember, the KGB/FSB, the special security services in Russia, they never treat any grassroots developments as being like self-organized. Right. In their view, it's always West-inflicted, CIA, or maybe Hillary Clinton personally, delivering the cookies, distributing cookies during the Maidan in Ukraine, etc., have contributed to those protests. And since 2012, when Putin came to power, understanding that the middle class in Russia was a threat, was not welcoming Putin anymore, deliberately implemented a series of the actions, which included substituting many of the middle-class jobs with more of the security service, like bureaucracy jobs, which has created subsequently this paradox within the Russian society. Bryn Rosenfeld from Cornell University has a great book about how the fact that the middle class in Russia is not bringing about modernization anymore. Since mid-2010s, the main middle-class jobs are actually bureaucracy and security service jobs, meaning that those people are not supporters of, free enterprise, liberties, democracy, and other great things that we used to associate to middle class and modernization in the West. So that was one change. Another one was the really serious repressions against the elites that started around that time to ensure that only loyal ones remain in power. And while at least until 2021, you couldn't seriously talk of mass repressions at the societal level, within the elites, certainly the Nikolai Petrov, for example, one of the main scholars of Russian elites, he does speak of mass-scale repressions against the elites starting around mid-2010s, precisely to ensure that there is loyalty within these groups to Putin, to the new direction of the country. For example, there is even at every single remotely significant town, not just city, but a town, there is an open criminal charge against their local administration, just in case, So they always know that this is some sort of Damocles sword hanging over their heads.
So it's like a preemptive charge?
Yes.
Just in case they
decide that they disagree with Putin for some reason.
Wow.
So these changes within the Russian society and the elites, they precede the war. If anything, you can argue that they were preemptive changes in anticipation of major escalation in Russia's relationship with the West. Economically, there was a lot of effort to bring capital back home, which certainly accelerated a lot after the war started, but it preceded it. And of course, last but not the least, right before the war, the Kremlin implemented a series of targeted repressions, specifically at the most influential actors within the grassroots sector in Russia, against the NGOs, independent journalists, and of course the opposition, including the first poisoning and subsequent murder of Alexei Navalny, among other political leaders in Russia. So all of these changes eventually eliminated the groups that could have potentially driven this discontent with the war. At the time, it was popular to believe that, maybe the war was the effort for Putin to stay in power. But I personally think that it was rather the repressions that preceded the war that were the preparations for the war. From where I come from, to me, Putin was actually quite secure in power back in 2021. He didn't need the war to sustain his hold on power because he basically, for the reasons that we flagged, eliminated most of the opposition to his rule before. What he really, though, wanted is just to make sure that once the war begins, there is no significant opposition emerging to the war within the society. And unfortunately, as we have seen over the last 3 years, he was successful in achieving that goal.
Right. So through repression, through being able to target the middle class, he was able to build a society that, for the most part, supported the regime without having any other additional mechanisms to do so.
If I can just quickly add one point, I'll have to say that the internal disputes within the West, the disagreements about what liberal democracy constitutes in the West, the progressive changes in the West also have somewhat eliminated in the eyes of many Russians this alternative ideal, the alternative pole where they so much aspired to belong. In the same way that the West served this ideal in late 80s, therefore driving, like the ideal helped drive many of the pro-democracy changes in the region at the time. Unfortunately, these days, the world is very open, and in the social media, right, everywhere you can see the internal domestic struggles in the West. The West itself disagrees on its sort of direction, and hence there is no very strong alternative, right, that the Russian liberals could rely on to show it to the local societies as an option.
So you don't have the shining example, the shining city on the hill type
anymore, unfortunately, yes.
So they just don't see it as such. What about, thinking about this group that could have maybe stood up against Putin, or at least offered some protest and resistance? When the war started, you had a mass exodus in Russia of a couple 100,000, if not millions, of Russians leaving the country to avoid, obviously, conscription, but also maybe a possible crackdown. Did those people leave? Were they possibly those maybe liberal-minded or democratic-minded Russians? So now you even more so condensing the population to be Putin supporters?
Yes, absolutely. And this is something I actually talk about in particular in my recently published report with the Atlantic Council entitled The Reluctant Consensus, December 2024. I try to, essentially the key inspiration behind the report was trying to understand what did we get wrong about Russia, right? Why did we not think that the war of this scale would be possible, or more maybe perhaps what did we learn as a result of the war about the Russian society? And one of the questions has to do where are these liberals, these people who protested in 2012, Putin return? Are they at home, or maybe they all have left, or maybe they ended up agreeing with Putin's war? Maybe he was convincing, or maybe they're just too afraid because of the repressions to speak up. And the answer is, first of all, we seem to have radically overestimated the number of such Russians. In the report, first of all, I claim that contrary to many arguments that question the reliability of Russian polls, most of the really established scholars of public opinion, including many of them academics with a really stellar reputation, who have tried to identify biases in the polls since the start of the war or the wave of repressions, have not been able to identify major changes in the sample composition, in response rates, in how people answer to sensitive questions, and even preference falsifications to the extent that they exist at all. Studies try to see if people are responding or reporting their opinions, say, about the war honestly, by using, for example, list experiments, a way to indirectly ask the question about, say, the war or Putin's support. Even such analysis either do not find any preference falsification, any significant preference falsification, or to the extent that it exists, it does not exceed 10% of all responses, which still, even at the official rate of war approval among Russians, about 70%, still, even if adjust to this preference falsification, gives you a majority of people supporting the war. And so the real answer as to where the liberals went is that there were very much fewer of them in the first place.
Right.
The actual number of the Russian liberals who are consistently pro-Western in their views, not just, want to stop the war for various reasons. Maybe they don't want the government to waste resources on this war. The actual number is between 7 and 10% of an entire Russian society. Within that group, which is already fairly small, you also have huge immigration at about, as you said, 100,000 to 1 million of people. But if you imagine an entire Russian society, nearing 150 million people with next Crimea now, you actually see that 1 million actually is not very important.
Right.
And it wasn't even significant enough to seriously affect the sample composition. So there were very few of them in the first place. Many of them have left. But in both instances, they are a minority that unfortunately has not been able to significantly influence the public opinion at the broader scale.
So how have we seen throughout the war over the last 3 years, has public opinion been swayed in any great way for the war or against it, or has it been roughly stable in Russia?
Yeah, it's so first of all, I think that we should not be thinking of the Russian public opinion in the same way we think of the Western one, because in the West, despite all the bubbles we live in here and whatnot, still there are different groups that are trying to influence our opinion. We're exposed to different positions, right? In Russia, basically, you have the state opinion and not much else. And despite the availability of the options available online these days in Russia, you actually can install, for example, Telegram, will be exposed to a variety of different opinions, or you can, say, download VPN and still access maybe some website that's been banned since the start of the war. Even then, Russians on the internet tend to disproportionately select pro-state position. Right. And so an ordinary Russian seems to approach the foreign policy developments of this scale in a way you approach a thunderstorm or rain. For example, it just happens. It's weather. Right. It's not up to us to decide. We have voted Putin in. He's a professional, often something that they tell you during the focus groups or interviews. And he knows better. I'm just an ordinary man. What do I know? If Putin says this got to be right. So it's more of an adjustment to a certain developments that does not really depend on them for majority of the Russians, rather than something that one can meaningfully affect with their own actions. This is one thing to keep in mind about Russian public opinion, especially on the matters that do not concern them personally. And you'd think that something like the war would concern them personally, especially when mobilization started. But most of the time, the regime has kept the war sort of, compartmentalized in a separate box. Many Russians in today's Russia, many people continue life as before, reporting that they haven't been really seriously affected, maybe by inflation in some way, but not more serious in any way. Second point is that within the Russian society, you can roughly select 3 different groups of people based on the salience of the war support and the attitude toward the war. The hawkish groups, the real staunch war supporters, are about 25-30%. And the war opponents are also about that number, also similar number. But within the war opponents groups, the liberals are only half of them. As I mentioned before, the other group are just people who are economically worse off. They just don't want the state to waste resources on something as useless as the war. The more interesting group is the majority in between these two poles, war supporters, war opponents, who are so-called loyalists. These are mostly conformist groups, and they go with the flow. They're the ones who tend to approach whatever happens in the foreign policy as the thunderstorm, but they also rely on the state. They trust the state very much, right? To them, it's like the identity is closely intertwined with reliance on the state, right? Russia is great power, state is strong, state knows what's right. And they are the ones who may not necessarily have very strong opinions about the war, but they tend to go with Putin with whatever he does. And if Putin tomorrow announces that the war should be stopped because it's, enough is enough, they will agree with that position. But as long as Putin is not saying that, as long as Putin keeps fighting this war, they will go with Putin. And the irony is that these groups are with Putin no matter what he does, pretty much in the polls. It's the hawks who are actually most of the time in opposition to Putin during the peaceful period of time. And they only join Putin when Putin starts wars, which is like in their views, finally, he's been strong internationally, right? He's showing the West like what Russia is great. And during these moments when he started the wars, hawks join the loyalists who are already with Putin in the first place. This is how you get the increase in Putin's approval that typically spikes after he starts the wars. At this point, he started about 5 wars. So every single time he does it, his approval spikes up. And that's because he already has the loyalists and he has the hawks who are joining the support.
Is it also in the conflicts, he doesn't necessarily define the political objective. So almost however they come out, he can claim it as a victory. Compared to if you define the political objectives up front, you can have a chance of missing them. So for this current conflict, he only really mentioned, he didn't say what land they would take or not take from what we've seen. He just mentioned the denazification of Ukraine and they're going to demilitarize Ukraine.
That's absolutely true. One of the paradoxes of this war is that there is not a single option as to why the war has begun that majority of Russians agree on. Like every single option typically gets below 50% of responses. And that includes, say, maybe saving Russian language speaking regions of Ukraine from this alleged, Ukrainization or whatever, stopping NATO aggression against Russia, like preventing like Nazification of Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. And yet the war has enjoyed the majority approval, even if deep inside Russians disagree as to why it started, which brings us back to my previous point. It's unfortunate reality of the Russian public opinion is that whatever Putin does internationally, they're likely to support it no matter what, even if they don't really understand as to why he's doing it. Because in their view, if he's doing it, he should have his own reasons and they should be good enough for them.
Well, you mentioned about the personal aspect of the war, that it affects people personally and they would protest or somehow react. So we saw this in the 1980s with the Soviet war in Afghanistan, where you have the mothers of soldiers coming out and putting pressure on the regime then. What's different now when you have hundreds of thousands, there's about 15,000 combat deaths in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Now we're having hundreds of thousands of deaths. So how is it not having a groundswell of pushback?
That's the great question. And I think it's like key to understanding what's different about today's Russia and what we misread about the end of the Soviet Union. Because Afghanistan and the war in Afghanistan is commonly used as one of the reasons as to why the Soviet Union ended. Very unpopular war, many dead people, co-infants coming back home, the so-called cargo 200, the Gruz 200. But the reality is, it seems to me, is that at the time, comparing to what's going on in the country where unfortunately, human life is not such a high value in Russia these days, and never has been. The real value is money. And what is different about the late Soviet time and today is that at the time the regime was out of money. It was against the backdrop of the economic crisis, and it was unable to cover the losses with some other material benefits that families of the soldiers would have received. This is very different from today. First of all, the regime learned from the experience of the partial mobilization in September 2022, when it was announced and people were captured in the streets and sent to Ukraine. And it was highly unpopular. It's the one single most unpopular development since the war started over the last 3 years was the partial mobilization. Putin's approval dropped by about 10%, serious blow. They learned from this experience, and now their recruitment is based on so-called volunteers. People like volunteering to serve. But why are they volunteering? Is that because they are offered extremely generous payments in return. For many people, especially from poor regions, it's a lot of money. Many, in some instances, one-time payoff just for signing off the contract is enough to purchase an apartment in your local town, village. And this has been a huge factor, I think, absent in late Soviet Union that helps offset any disappointment. Because the way an average Russian tends to view this, first of all, nobody's forced to go to the war. These people are volunteering, and they're volunteering in exchange for money. So it wasn't free. They knew the deal. And that's what they got. They got a lot of money, but in exchange for their lives, too bad, but that was their choice. That's the way they see it. And in a lot of ways, they're even thankful to the regime for it, because they essentially, this is the way for them to avoid having to deal with the war, right? Somebody else goes to fight, to endure all these costs of the war, while they get to, stay in Moscow and enjoy their lifestyles.
Right. So the conscripts in the 1980s were not receiving the benefits.
Not at all of this similar scale that really has been a significant factor sustaining the short-term economic boom in Russia, because you just have a lot of people with money suddenly, creating all this demand and increasing the growth domestically.
So can the Russian economy afford to keep these high cost soldiers on the front line? Are they going to be able to sustain that with everything else that the Russian economy is having to bear with this war footing?
That's the most important question for many analysts, because ultimately it's the question as to how long can the Kremlin pull this off. And the answer is yes and no. No, in the sense that indeed Russian economy is at capacity when it comes to, for example, labor. If it wanted to, say, create new industries or produce more of some goods in order to satisfy the existing demand, it cannot, because basically reached its potential. The unemployment is at historical low at the 2.3, 2.4%. And in that sense, there is limits as to how much it can grow. Indeed, it did grow at 3-4% in the previous several years. But the forecast for the next 2 years is actually that the growth will significantly decline, 1%, which is basically nothing. But on the other hand, even if there is no growth, there is no reason why the Kremlin cannot still just keep printing money or devaluing ruble vis-a-vis dollar. They're still receiving a lot of oil revenues. And the economists are saying that just looking at the sheer numbers alone, the Kremlin can pull this off for quite a while. We do have an accelerated inflation, which is inevitable in this situation when you have too much demand, not enough supply. And you have slowing down of the economic growth. Altogether, it is a risk of stagflation, which is very predictable in this Keynesian style economy. But it's not catastrophic for the Kremlin. The inflation is maybe in 2 digits, about 10-11%. But again, this is not something that it can't handle. I just remind our audiences that in Turkey, Erdogan has been able to get reelected with 60% inflation. And he is handling a much more democratic society than Russia is. So from that perspective, the situation is not perfect, but it's far from being unsustainable.
So from what we're hearing so far is that the Russian population in general has been able to shoulder the burden of the conflict, either because they're not really feeling it, because in a sense they're protected from it, or if they are feeling the war, they're compensated to a reasonable extent. So that's keeping them happy with the regime, and otherwise their lives haven't changed that dramatically for them to resist. But the one point that you did note that was unpopular was the mobilization, when people actually have to fight without them volunteering. They're actually being mobilized. So looking at the beginning of the war, when the Russians were getting ready to invade, they had a relatively small army force for what they possibly, whatever the goal had been to achieve. Was that part of it, do you think, in Putin's calculation? They do not want to bring on these reservists. They want the war to be over quickly because knowing that it would be unpopular? Or was it a shock that about 300,000 reservists that were called up in late 2022, it was a largely unpopular move?
I think there were a number of reasons as to the underlying Putin's original calculus. First of all, short, victorious war is always better than a long atrocious and questionably, the victory, the ability of Russia to deliver, even on his minimalist goals to quote unquote denazify, liberate Donetsk and Luhansk region at this point are questionable. He thinks still that he will achieve these goals, but Russia is advancing at a very slow rate at about 3 kilometers per month at the expense of 35 to 40,000 people. So you can estimate that it's about 10,000 people per kilometer. It's quite a waste. And not a single, I think, Western style democracy would be able to pull this off for a while. Russia has a lot of people and it's very autocratic, so these people have nowhere to complain, but certainly it's suboptimal. The wars also have a tendency to get out of control. They're typically unpredictable. There's so-called fog of the war It's very hard to understand what's going to happen on the ground if you feel like you have the best of cards, which is what Putin felt vis-a-vis Ukraine. Ukraine was on paper much weaker in terms of human resources, economic resources, and whatnot. And yet, certainly he got stuck in this situation, which would have been quite unpredictable for him. Was the West more united in its commitment to back Ukraine? So certainly his first preference would have been to end this in a short way. Don't also forget that Putin has a security service background, and his wars typically less of conventional wars as they are actual special operations indeed. So sudden attack when nobody expects, like distract the attention, information coverage, right? False flag operations meant to distract. And then very quick action that is way less military focused than it is like basically a security service operation. So that did not work out for him. And originally he faced serious consequences, right? It was not a given that he would be able to get the elites in the society under control. And if anything, the Prigozhin rebellion a couple of years ago, right, it did demonstrate that there are a lot of unpredictabilities associated to it. Even now that we are talking of this like relative resilience of Russia, there are still a lot of unknowns, right? If the war continues for way longer, if people get tired, it's not completely impossible that another Prigozhin will emerge, for example. Even if, yes, I would argue Prigozhin was quite a unique situation in terms of, let's say, weapons at his disposal and whatnot, still there are a lot of unknowns in this situation. Plus, as you flagged at, what I show is that it's the unique ability of the regime to still insulate the majority of the society from the actual personal cost of this war. That is one of the major reasons as to why this war has not been as unpopular as it should have been. But again, the extent that Putin is able to pull this off indefinitely is questionable, right? Eventually, the cost will become high. And we don't know exactly when this will happen and if it will happen at all with all these major changes and the possible peace talks. But it's not completely unfeasible, and that could potentially become very detrimental for him.
And for the domestic population that Putin's facing, we talked about the protests in 2011, 2012, but the victories that he's received on the foreign policy fronts, particularly 2014, obviously the annexation of Crimea and a fait accompli operation, like you're mentioning, that would probably be more of a security service type operation than a conventional conflict. And if this would have obviously paid off in another fait accompli of toppling the government, perhaps. It seems like the victories that Putin has had from 2014 onward have also solidified his base, and that people have beginning to have extreme faith in him and that he knows what he's doing. Have we seen that even though the war is kind of stagnated? So he had these big victories, 2014, 2015. But even now, as the war enters its third year, that still hasn't broken that, I guess, faith, if you will, in Putin's leadership?
It was starting to break this faith. That's actually a very good point. I have to say that if you read Max Weber, right, Russian power legitimation is in a lot of ways traditional, right? Putin is much more than the president. He's a tsar in a lot of ways. And it's important to keep in mind there's this irrational dimension to his support. But in 2022, especially among the elites, as we know, based on leak phone conversation that will make an interesting Russian linguist learn a lot of ways to curse.
Yes.
The Russian elites were extremely unhappy about Putin very early on. And those conversations, especially after the sanctions followed, the Western punishment has followed, the scale of it definitely was underestimated by the Kremlin, by the decision makers. And that definitely shaked his support within these groups. There are two reasons as to why this didn't go further. First of all is that Russia is good at adaptation, right? This is historically true. This was true in this war. And the adjustment was successful over time, especially after 2022 in the fall when they lost a lot of newly occupied territories as a result of Ukraine's counteroffensive. They readjusted and they were essentially being able to more successfully push forward, again, at extreme cost, but nonetheless. Second, the Russian political system is not conventional Western system, right? I keep going back to this point. You have technically Russian elites. But the reality is that they're not independent political actors of the type that you have in the West. Even in the West, right, it's questionable looking at some political parties' behavior. Sometimes it's unclear to what extent they preserve their independence vis-a-vis the leader. But in Russia, it's very clear they have no independence. And to them, essentially exiting the system is the end. It's as good as it gets. Basically, these people are holders of the wallets or assets that are temporarily given to them by the regime, and they don't have any political autonomy or independence. And that is one of the reasons why we haven't seen individual sanctions succeed, for example. Because these are not the independent actors able to, unite in some sort of collective actions and build a unified front, just because that other than being holders of these assets that have been delegated to them by the Kremlin, they don't really have any political autonomy. So in private conversations, they always claim that the moment Putin is gone, they'll take control and they will never allow anything like this to happen. And the question, of course, is what is to stop them before?
Right.
And they lack any autonomy.
Right, because the individual sanctions put on by the West were targeted in the hopes of influencing decision-making, but you're not hitting the people who are actually the decision-makers. Those
who are decision-makers are unlikely to change their minds. They're really too deep inside into this system. Like, you can sanction Putin all you want, or Patrushev. I don't think they're going to realize that they were wrong and, defect to the West. And those who are not important, they have been sanctioned, but the actual agency is very limited. Right. That is not to say that the individual sanctions are wrong. I actually think that, if anything, that they limit the ability of these individuals to travel to the West and corrupt the corresponding systems. Like the Russian oligarchs have been known to corrupt the countries in which they resided. So at least as a way for the West to limit the impact of these groups, I think they are not useless. But I think they're unlikely to achieve a political change in Russia.
Could it go the other way, where putting the sanctions on them force those oligarchs that might have been, maybe leaning liberal, push them just into the Russian camp because they simply no longer can go anywhere else? Could it happen? How do we know which way they go?
That's the argument I often hear from some of the lobbying groups who are trying to lift sanctions on Russian oligarchs. But we also have the counterfactual. That's the rare case in social science where actually we do have a counterfactual, which is 2014. After when it happened, there were not as many individual sanctions imposed specifically on the Russian oligarchs. And they had 8 years until 2022 to defect if they were really in disagreement with Putin's policies, right? What happened? Like, what stopped them? Somehow they did not do this. So honestly, I think that for these people, material benefits and other arguments, like other ways in which they depend on the systems, maybe it may be the threat of retaliation, the repressions if they leave, if they exit. Or that, as I said before, that losing this material well-being for them is identical to losing an entire status, and essentially nothing else is left. Whatever the actual reason is, I don't think they're defecting under any circumstances. So I don't think we should really be, too upset about hurting them. I think they should be understood as a legitimate part of Putin's system, and they should be dealt as such.
So is the loyalty, whether we're talking about the elites and the oligarchs or even just the general population, is the loyalty more towards Putin or to a nationalist idea of Russia, or is it a blend of those? Like how do we divide those, or are they together, this idea of nationalist Russia or Putin?
It's a great question. So I think it's more about the loyalty to the state. Historically in Russia, based on lack of civil society, very low collective action ability, the state was the only institution, basically, that tends to resolve a lot of collective action problems for the society. Without the state, technically, you have a vacuum. If you remember, after Prigozhin started his, coup and walked to Rostov, one of the cities, the key shocking development for the observers was that there was not a lot of resistance to Prigozhin on the side of the Russian society. Many constructed that as lack of popularity of Putin. But it's not really, if you know Russian society a little bit, necessarily the demonstration of either loyalty to Prigozhin of Putin or lack of thereof. It's just lack of collective action that is very typical for Russian society. That is, if you don't have the state, you have a vacuum, typically. or a chaos. That's why the state is cherished, and its survival for many is existential, and it's also typically associated with Russian greatness, because when the state is strong, unfortunately, historically, it means that Russia is imperialistic and revanchist on the international stage.
And the state often is aligned with the church, the Russian Orthodox Church.
And all the nationalist symbols. And
right.
Typically, strong state reinforces these nationalist narratives, like of the Nicholas I style, orthodoxy, Tsar,
right.
Samodержавие, and the people. These are the themes that are, again, consistent within the Russian history. When the state is strong, it typically would impose this nationalism associated to strength of Russia, and it typically also has imperialist undertones. It means that Russia controls neighboring states, showcasing its strength. That is why it's actually so hard for the Russian liberals to counter that narrative, because Russian nationalism does not have a lot of its own democratic narrative. Mm-hmm. If anything, Alexei Navalny was one, and also early Yeltsin, they were the ones of the early trying to attempt to construct the idea of Russian nationhood in associated to democracy. Mm-hmm. But in doing so, they typically run into opposition from the revanchist imperial circles, and they typically would be unable to build a strong enough opposition following, for their cause. For Navalny, the most notorious example was 2014 Crimea annexation, which split Russian nationalists across these lines. Some claimed that Russia should be democratic and maybe contained within its borders. Others said, hey, but what about Crimea? It has ethnic Russians in there, and why do you want us to, abandon this cause while it's very clearly a Russian nationalist cause? And this is also imperial legacy, and, the fact that there are ethnic Russians left outside of Russian borders, that sort of reinforces the problem. And both early Yeltsin during his more democratic period and Navalny in the similar effort run into the same problem. We also see that in our work project with Graham Robertson from UNC Chapel Hill and Peter Pomerantsev, we have studied how responsive are Russians to these narratives of the Russian greatness. Mm-hmm. And one particularly disturbing discovery is a fairly mild prompt about Russian greatness. So you, for example, ask a Russian as to whether they believe Russia is great and what is particularly great about Russian culture. Is it literature? Is it state, it's military, whatnot? That itself is enough to quite meaningfully increase Russian support for military action in Ukraine.
Wow.
So basically, you can see how the state propaganda works, right? You remind Russians about the greatness, mm-hmm. and that Russian historical greatness in their mind is very closely intertwined with military action, imperialism, revanchism. And unfortunately, that allows the Kremlin a very prolific ground to then implement all sorts of horrible international actions.
Well, with all that in consideration, what do you think we need to walk away from this with the domestic audience? For the war is obviously continuing, there's peace negotiations going on, but it's definitely not clear that there will be a peace in the Russian-Ukraine war anytime soon, maybe. But with that, what can we expect out of the Russian population going forward, particularly if the war lasts for a while, if we have another year of this?
Russia as a country has been quite resilient. I have mentioned this during the panel, that Russia is never as strong as we're afraid, as we fear, but it's never as weak as we hope. And I think this war yet again has reconfirmed this old saying. And with that in mind, we should understand that Russia right now is being led by very hostile anti-Western leadership, that no effort to, reset relationship with Russia or to understand Putin or, to acknowledge certain mistakes that were made by the West, hoping that maybe Putin, will be also more reconciliatory oriented, will help eliminate that problem. That as long as Putin is in power, but more likely as long as the regime is in power, meaning not just Putin, but also the elites, Russia will continue to be a very serious threat for the liberal international order. And even if this war is frozen temporarily, this is not going to be the end of the war. Putin is at the fight not just against Ukraine and its sovereignty, but also against the West, the way he sees it. And he will continue to be progressively more hostile as we have seen this evolution. And unfortunately, him staying long in power, if anything, makes him even more dangerous. So this is far from over. We'll be unfortunately faced with this very sad reality in the long term. And if anything, challenges to the West keep multiplying, with China also becoming potentially more militant and dangerous, and the West remaining more disunited against these rising threats.
Well, those are all challenges we're going to have to face, and hopefully we find a solution to. Thank you so much, Maria. That was an excellent conversation. Thank you. And that's going to wrap up another episode of GNSI's video series. Today, we were joined by Dr. Maria Snegovaya, and we discussed the Russian domestic front and the war in Ukraine. We thank you for watching, and we hope you tune in to another episode of GNSI's video series.